thank you all for joining the Society for Clinical Research Sites and ACRO for our mini-series called Trial Odyssey. This will be a 4-part series, and our presenters today will probably talk a little bit more about it after I'm done. I don't want to step all over their presentation. But our first module today is establishing our trajectory and overview and assessment of the impact of ICH E6R2 on sites and sponsors. And we'll be presented by Nicole Stansbury of PPD and Kristin Mauri from BioClinica. This presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a survey. In order for you to successfully receive your contact hour credit, you must be logged into WebEx as an individual, remain present for the webinar in its entirety, and complete the post-webinar survey. If these 3 requirements are met, you'll receive a contact hour certificate from me via email within 30 days. There is no contact hour credit offered for listening to the recording of this presentation. If you have any problems with that, please send me an email and I'll help you out. If you have any questions, you can use the Q&A feature. There's an icon in the upper right of your WebEx screen with a question mark in it. That's the Q&A feature if you have a question for the presenters today. The webinar will continue for approximately 1 hour, and I'll now turn over to Nicole Stansbury and Kristin Mauri.
Thanks, Mike, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for part 1 of this 4-part series named A Clinical Trial Odyssey. Risk-based monitoring is a concept that has been in play in our industry for really quite some time. However, with the issuance of ICH E6R2 in late 2016, it's really taken on a whole new significance. And at the site level, if you have not already started to feel the impact of this change in guidance, you will very soon. This 4-part series, we're going to explain the evolution of risk-based monitoring and particularly focus on the impact it has and will have in the future on you at the clinical site. Throughout this series, we really want to maintain an open dialogue about the changes in ICH, and by the end of the series, our objective is to help you have a better understanding of this guidance, and in particular, turn any doubts that you might have about risk-based monitoring into a new level of understanding, which is really going to help all of us see and feel the benefit of the changes coming along with this guidance. Risk-based monitoring, it's not about being less diligent in what we do. It's really all about focusing our efforts on what matters to ensure subject safety and the data quality coming out of our trials. So before we get into the content today, I want to say and give a special thanks to Crystal Gertzmacher, who you will not hear from today, but she participated in the development of the content for part 1 of the series, and you will specifically hear from her in part 4. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole briefly to introduce herself, and then I will introduce myself, Kristin Mauri, and then we'll get started.
I'm Nicole Stansbury. I'm Executive Director of Adaptive and Intelligent Monitoring at PPD. I have 26 years experience in the industry, with the first 6 years being as a study coordinator at 2 different multi-therapeutic sites. The last 20 years I've spent at PPD in roles such as a CRA, a project manager, and the last 8 years specifically focused on our risk-based monitoring strategy.
So again, Kristin Mauri, I am the Global Head of Risk-Based Monitoring at BioClinica. I've been in the industry about 24 years. I started my career as a CRA and have spent the majority of my time on the clinical operations side in various different sizes of companies, really executing clinical trials. Earlier, we've entitled this four-part series, A Clinical Trial Odyssey. And you can see on the screen here, the definition of an odyssey is the wandering journey or voyage marked by change and self-discovery. And then the objective of this series is to take this journey of understanding RBM together. We want to look at the benefits of it and really understand the impact it's going to have on all of us. So with today's session, we're going to start with a bit of education. We're going to take a look at the revised IH guidelines, discuss the impact from both the site and the sponsor perspective, and then use a real-world example to put these changes into context. Before I get into the content, we would like you all to participate in a polling question. So you can see it on the screen here. We'd like to get a little bit of baseline information from our audience. So if you could please answer the question, I understand the impact of ICH E6R2 for my site as it relates to monitoring, not at all, a little, or very much. So waiting for those polling results to come in, we're going to look at really the reason behind this change to the ICH guidelines in over 20 years. And so the next set of slides are coming directly from the ICH team as they were rolling out these changes. And they will start and help us understand why this addendum was needed. So we all know, if you've been in the industry for some time, we know that times have changed. Our trials are more complex, they're more global, and they're certainly more expensive to execute. At the same time that we have these increased complexities going on, we know technology has evolved significantly over this past 20 years as well. ICH is feeling like we need, at this point in time, take advantage of these advances in technology and really use them to help us deal with these challenges that we're facing. By this update, ICH is giving sponsors and the sites really the permission to focus on the things that matter in a clinical trial, allow us to truly step away from the old mindset of trying to control and prevent every possible error out there, and really focusing our efforts on the errors that bring the biggest risk to patient safety and data quality. And this new mindset is the mindset that's going to allow us to put in place better ways to execute our trials. So for a second and just review the poll results. It looks like right now, overwhelmingly, the audience understands the impact of ICH E6 a little. So we hope to move all of us up the spectrum of understanding by certainly the end of this discussion today, but also by the end of the four-part series. The whole objective of this addendum is to help force the industry's hand to modernize, to use technology to support a better way of doing things, with the end result being more efficient drug development, a safer environment for our patients, and higher quality data from which to draw these conclusions around the safety and the efficacy of the drugs that we're developing. Okay, look at the guidance from the lens of yourselves, from the sites, and changes that are going to impact you. There's really two main changes that you as the investigator site need to be aware of. This change is in section 4.2, and here the language was updated, and it was really strengthened around the adequate resources, moving from the old guidance that we see on the left-hand side, which essentially was saying that the PI needed to ensure that everyone was doing what they needed to be doing, and that there were enough people in place to do the work. When we look at the right-hand side and the new language, it's really a lot stronger, and it makes the investigator responsible now, not moving from ensuring to responsibility for supervising and everyone who is working on the trial. And if tasks or services that are retained to be performed by a third party, the PI is responsible to ensure the integrity of those tasks and data that were delegated. So the question here is, how to comply? How do I actually make sure that I'm in compliance with this new language? Obviously, you need to have the proper documentation in place to ensure it's really clear how the oversight and the responsibility of the PI is being maintained. I'm sure that you have delegation logs in place today, but we really need to go a step beyond that. Those can sometimes be a bit confusing. So our advice here is really to make sure that you put additional notes to file in place to help interpret those delegated duties and ensure that you're showing that the PI is truly responsible for what is going on. The second is the addition of 4.9.0 to the section of records and reports, where IH has added this overarching statement giving investigators specific responsibility to maintain adequate and accurate source documentation. It says here that the documents need to be attributable, legible, complete, original, and any changes to these documents, they can't be obscured, and should be explained via audit trail if necessary. So the last piece around audit trail is likely for situations where we're moving into e-source or types of documentation that are not necessarily paper-based. And in an electronic world, as the investigator, as the sites, you need to ensure that any changes to electronic documents are auditable and clear. This is really just doing more of what you're doing. Document, document, document. We all hear that on a daily basis, and it continues to be critical. The changes at the site level, let's move into looking at the changes that are impacting the sponsors. These are really important at the site level because these are the things that are likely going to result in changes in behaviors and activities coming from the CRAs, the CROs, and the sponsors. A lot of changes that impact the sponsors, but if we look at this in summary, it is now telling sponsors that overall quality management needs to be injected into our processes, and we need to be incorporating a risk-based approach inclusive of centralized monitoring to support the reduction and the extent and frequency of on-site monitoring. So while ICH here is advocating less on-site monitoring, that might seem a little counterintuitive to the expectation that ultimately we're increasing quality, because, as I stated earlier, ICH has recognized that through technological advancements, we're able to maintain and even actually elevate the quality of what we're doing through centralized processes, which are more efficient and effective at certain aspects of monitoring. I want to on-site monitoring, it isn't going away. That contact that you have between and connection between sites, PIs, and CRAs is still critically important. It's really just that the focus of what the CRA is doing, the interactions that they're having with you on site are now going to shift, and they're going to elevate to focus on things that matter, because we can leverage the technology to take out the noise, which is going to allow the CRAs to assist you in a better way. So IH is very clear here. They recommend centralized monitoring, and the things that we can do centrally, remotely, such as identifying missing data, outliers, looking at trends in the data, really analyzing site characteristics and performance, that can all be done centrally via the support and help of technology. Using this centralized data process and methodology is going to allow COs and sponsors to identify which sites need more assistance, need more monitoring versus those that don't. At this stage in our industry of adoption in terms of risk-based monitoring and centralized monitoring, we're not necessarily at this point seeing a significant cut in overall on-site monitoring that's occurring across the study. We're just seeing that it's shifting the focus of what we're doing on site, again, to those sites that can benefit the most from the providence of more help. Looking to do here is we're looking to eliminate that one-size-fits-all approach. Not every site needs the same level of monitoring based on experience, based on staffing, etc. And centralized monitoring is really going to allow us to help tailor what we're doing from a monitoring perspective. So significant changes for sponsors is really the addition of Section 5.0 in the guidance. And this outlines 7 steps that sponsors and CROs are now required to follow, or it's heavily suggested to follow, to ensure quality of management occurs in the study. From identification during the protocol development process of the critical processes and data in the study that we want to focus on, to looking at and performing a risk identification exercise, and then throughout the rest of the process, evaluating those risks, determining how they're going to be controlled, communicated, reviewed, and reported out. So this process that sponsors not need to follow, but they need to document that they're following to show compliance. There's been in various sections of the monitoring section of the guidance, which are essentially saying, again, I said this earlier, that our monitoring needs to be risk-based, and that a portion of that needs to come or should come from centralized monitoring activities. Sponsor perspective, they've added to section 5.18.6. This is the section essentially says that sponsors need to get the results from their various vendors and parties, sites, and CROs that are working on the to ensure that the oversight that the sponsor is providing is adequate. They need to ensure that the monitoring is happening appropriately and according to the monitoring plan, and that when follow-up is needed, it's actually occurring. So it's just a new level of responsibility and documentation. 5.18.7 is brand new, and this now makes sponsors be responsible for making sure that the monitoring plan that is developed is really specific to site protection, data integrity, and includes all types of monitoring. And that monitoring, again, is focused on the critical data and processes. And to me, this section is really the license for us to move away, in but not all cases, from 100% SDV to really targeted SDV, focusing on the stuff that's critical in the trial. Some of that impact the sponsor, which you may or may not feel at the site level, is that sponsors are now required to perform a formal and documented root cause analysis and implement preventative and corrective actions when significant noncompliance is discovered. That's that, the study, the program, and then down to the site level. The last change we'll talk about today impacting the sponsors is just some additional changes, to the essential document section. And the most specific to you at the site level is that the sponsors need to ensure that sites have control of the essential documents and that you have access to the records when you need them. In terms of a very high-level overview of the impacts that we feel are most important to the sites and the sponsors. So, do a polling question before I turn it over to Nicole. And so, based on that overview, would you please answer the same question that you answered when I started around your level of understanding of the changes to ICH E6?
Kristin? Sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me, Kristin?
I can hear you, yes.
Great, thank you. And have you seen the slide progress? Want to check that?
Yes.
Okay. So while that poll is closing, we'll take a look at some examples of ICH E6 R2 in practice. This will hopefully help give you an idea of a real-life example of what centralized monitoring can provide. Before we get started on this one, we will ask another polling question. So I'll give just a minute for people to launch that one. And as you hear,
one you gave.
Yeah, well, I'll jump in there, Nicole, and say the good news is that based on the results of the second polling question, it looks like we have moved the crowd, the audience, up the spectrum in terms of understanding the guidance. We had a majority of a little understanding to begin with, and now people are saying that they feel like they very much understand it.
So the next polling question going, and while this question is being answered, I'm going to start to explain a little bit more about centralized monitoring. So here's an example of the quality risk management process. So as Kristin described, the very first step in the process for risk management is to identify our critical processes and our critical data. Take an example of a trial that has a primary endpoint of cognitive rating scales. And so in this example, the critical data for this would be the cognitive rating scale values, and the critical process would be the collection or the conduct of those cognitive rating scales. So then now we've identified what the critical process and critical data are, we would move to the next step in the process, which is risk identification. So what could go wrong with these cognitive rating scales? And this is where historical information, previous experience, all of these things come into play. And a cross-functional team typically includes CRO and the sponsor representatives. We'll sit down and discuss what could go wrong with these rating scales based on our previous experience and our knowledge. And one of the things that we are looking at are things like site not using a certified rater, not using the same rater within a subject not having eaten prior to completing the scales. Complete scales are scales that are completed out of order. All of these things are very particular in how the protocol is written and designed. And so it's important, and these might be some risks that are identified early on that would either, in this case, probably cause us to have some concern about the integrity of the data. This is just one example. Other examples of critical process and critical data are typically things like collection of adverse events, reporting of SAEs. Those types of things would also likely be included as critical process and critical data. But for this particular example, we're just going to look at cognitive rating scales. So the next step in the process is to evaluate that risk. So then we would have cross-functional team members who are experts in this therapeutic area, in this particular indication and in the protocol, to assess risks that were identified. What kinds of deviations to these, with these risks that we've identified could have significant impact to the data. And then based on that risk evaluation, we're going to look at some of these, and some of them, the medical monitor, the statisticians may come back and say, you know, those we're really the most concerned about, and so we need to look at putting some risk controls in place for these. But these other ones might not be as important, and so therefore we will just watch them. We won't put controls in place. We won't write edits. Won't have them include as specific CRAs need to look at in a monitoring plan. But first, we might want to take a very different approach and develop some statistical analyses to look at while the trial is running, while the data is being collected, so that we can alert the sites to any concerns that we have in some of this data, in case they're not following the protocol when it comes to executing or collecting the data around these primary endpoints. And so the fourth step in the process is risk control. Once we've evaluated the risks at this point, we've determined which ones we need to have risk controls around, we'll look at ways we can do that. So in this particular example, we might decide to add some instructions in the protocol that set expectations around that cognitive scale conduct and collection. If we really want the scales collected or conducted in a certain order, we need to make sure that that is classified and specified within the protocol. For example, might be including training at the investigators meeting for the raters. So if using certified raters is important, let's determine the way that we're going to all the raters consistently and make sure that that is happening, and that the expectations around that are known to everyone that's going to be participating in the trial. We met having our data management teams add edit checks for scales that appear to be out of range or for missing data. You might want to alert us to sites where they have a trend in the number of data that's missing for these cognitive rating scales, or the volume of scales that appear to be out of range. That's going to give us a signal to a CRA, for example, that should pay close attention to the data that's being collected at this particular site. In some cases, we can narrow that down to even a particular subject and say, look at data for this particular subject. It doesn't seem to appear to be as consistent as what we would expect in a trial like this. We'd also ensure that the monitoring plan has expectations for the CRAs to look for things like continuity in the raters and for specific protocol deviations that were important. And then we might add some risk controls looking at centralized monitoring plan to ensure that it has trending of the cognitive rating scale scores so that it can identify anomalies that might signal potential transcription errors or protocol deviation. And this particular example is one that we'll go into a little bit more detail about. And an example of how we might take a centralized monitoring example around these cognitive rating scale anomalies. So if you can think of it for a minute, in traditionally monitored studies, you have sites on the trial, each site enrolling 10 patients, that's 1,000 patients across 100 sites. One CRA is probably only going to have, at most, 10 sites that they're responsible for. So out of those 1,000 patients, the CRAs, even when they're doing 100% source data review and source document verification, may only see 100 of those 1,000 patients. And looking at those 100 patients all at once, the enrollment is very slow, or let's say a year's time frame. That CRA may be looking at 1 or 2 patients at a time, and certainly at each monitoring visit, they're probably only looking at 1 patient and 2 visits per patient. Hard for them to be able to see trends across variable like a cognitive rating scale. And when you're only looking at perhaps 10% of the data and not all of the data compared to all the other patients in the trial, it's hard to pick out anomalies in that data. And so in this example, you can see a central monitoring example where we have each of these lines is representing a different patient on the trial. And you can see very clearly that there might be a couple of patients that stand out in this example. So pick on here for just a second. And the first one, you see that this particular patient has a pretty clear spike in their cognitive rating scale at the visit 4 interval. So this information might be looking at this is, and I saw a question just pop up about what's the different axes. So you can say on the left-hand side, the number is going up 30 to 55. Let's see for an example that this might be the actual rating scale score itself. And across the bottom, you'll see that these are the scores across the visits for each patient. So each of these lines is a patient. And you see that this patient had their cognitive rating scale score at like 37 at visit 1, it was 37 again at visit 2, it was 37 again at visit 3, then all of a sudden it went up to 52 at visit 4, and then it was back down to like 36 at visit 5, 36 at visit 6. So seeing some, an anomaly is this visit 4 rating scale for this particular patient. So in this centralized monitoring example, the central monitor might send a query to the CRA who's responsible for that site to just ask them to look more closely. Instead of looking at everything for every patient at this particular monitoring visit, they might say, pay particular attention to the rating scale for this particular patient. And then another example of a scale anomaly. And in this one, you can see that this patient has quite a bit of variability across the rating scales that are not consistent at all. And so this would be another query from a centralized monitor where they're asking the CA to look at the entire, in their entirety. Go ahead and look at all the rating scales for this particular patient. Is there, because some inconsistencies compared to other patients on the trial that we're seeing in their cognitive rating scales. Now, what happens with this information once these queries are issued or once the findings are issued and sent to the CRA? Well, the CRAs are going to perform their monitoring investigations, and this is where they can perform these. Sometimes they'll be required to perform them on site. Sometimes they can perform and investigate some of these remotely. In this particular example, this would be something that we would probably want the CRAs to look at on site. And so for these particular findings, the CRA is first going to look and ask themselves, was this a transcription error? I was alerted to the anomaly in the data, and I'm going to go and I'm going to investigate it. The first thing I'm going to look at is the obvious, was it a transcription error? If it's a transcription error, they can clearly see the source documentation does not match the form, they'll issue a query. If they'll move to the second step in the process, which is, hey, data is accurate, but let me ensure that they followed the process. What are a protocol deviation that occurred? We're actually collecting this particular value or this rating scale. And so look and see if there is a protocol deviation. It could be that there was a protocol deviation. Maybe not use a certified rater. In the first example I showed you, most likely it's probably a transcription error when it's one visit for value that's out of range. That typically would represent something along the lines of a transcription error most of the time. But the one where you saw a lot of variability across the patient, that could be that this site was not using a certified rater or that they were changing raters for each visit rather than using a consistent rater as was described by the protocol. Could be a deviation, like they could have had the subject not eat as they should have prior to the rating scale completions at each visit. That could be something, a particular protocol deviation that the CRAs pick up on. The types of things are exactly what the CRAs will be looking for with those centralized monitoring findings. They're very targeted findings. They're specific for certain patients, and it is a much more holistic look at the data that any one individual CRA could look at, only looking at their subjects, their sites, and trying to use the technology in those ways. In some cases, the CRA is going to investigate both the transcription error and the protocol deviations, but what they're going to find in some cases is everything was done appropriately. It is what it is. We can't find a deviation. Does seem to be transcription error, but we've confirmed that the data is what it is. It's accurate as far as we can tell, and it was conducted appropriately. So it's a very useful tool for CRAs. Finally, saying, well, what happens after all of this? Well, the risk management process is a process. It's a continuum. All the steps repeat themselves. As the CRAs are finding and identifying issues and investigating them on site, they're reporting back to the team and letting them know what we found. We found transcription error, we fixed it. We found a protocol deviation, we conducted training on the site. And as we're taking a look at all of these things that we're finding in centralized monitoring, we're looking at risks to the entire trial. And so we're asking ourselves, you know, is there new risk that we've identified now that we weren't expecting at the beginning of the trial? And if there is, let's add those to that risk register. Make sure that we're training the sites on risks of noncompliance, the conduct of those cognitive scales. Then let's make sure that we are meeting with the sponsor and the RO on a regular basis to review the queries that have been issued, the deviations that have been reported, and centralized monitoring findings or trends so that we can determine if new controls need to be put in place for trial. Do we need to adjust or adapt site training? To adjust or adapt the protocol? Do we need to adjust or adapt our monitoring strategies? Do we need to increase edits or listings that we're performing from a data management perspective? Do to increase a sampling or what we're looking at from a monitoring perspective? Is something that we didn't realize was a risk now important, and we need to add that to our list of critical data that we working at the beginning of the trial. So it's a cycle that we have to go through and continue this process. And in order to comply with the new guidelines, we would also be providing a monthly report on any decision actions related to these centralized monitoring findings to the client. So it keeps our whole risk management process very nice, tight cycle. And we're constantly improving our monitoring techniques and strategies as we look at the risks and investigate those throughout the course of the trial. So there, you're going to see from the previous polling question that you know, see the difference in the value of supplementing on-site monitoring with centralized monitoring. So give you just a second here to answer this particular polling question and to move on to some key takeaways. And while you're doing that, and then we will have a minute to answer some Q&A. And a few coming in, so we'll have a good Q&A session here. But just to review, in the examples that we've provided today, some expected benefits of taking this path. Some of the benefits are that there'll be fewer critical findings and audits than in traditionally monitored studies. And in fact, we've seen this in CROs and sponsors that have already taken some early steps in using centralized monitoring. Really started to see some of these things. In addition, we should be able to see more timely review of data using remote and centralized techniques. This is for faster identification of issues and remediation before mistakes are repeated. So this results in better patient safety and as well as better data integrity. Another benefit is that it creates more time for CRAs to work with the sites on root cause analysis and process improvement. So we do identify that this was a transcription error, this was a protocol deviation. Not spending as much time trying to find every other example of those as we are trying to work with the site to say, let's figure out why this deviation occurred. Was it a misunderstanding? Was it a failure in a step in the process? This is going to be able to allow CRAs to spend more quality time with site personnel working on the things that matter versus dealing with some inconsequential things like transcription errors or not dotting your I's or crossing your T's, and those kinds of things. And then it'll allow sites to spend more time on the things that matter, such as patient care and process improvement. And this allows for a better patient centricity in our clinical trials. So here, that it looks like we've got a very strong understanding of the value of supplementing on-site monitoring with centralized monitoring here, and I think that's a very good result. Very good there. So, open up for questions and move over to our little chat here and see if we can get questions. And Kristin, are you back on the line again?
Yeah, yes.
One question here is about how does one differentiate between an anomaly due to error versus a potential true clinical effect? So it's really hard to do that unless you actually go and look and see if that error, if that anomaly, if you can rule out the transcription error or the protocol deviation. And that's what we're really trying to do in these cases is we've identified an anomaly. It looks different than other data in the trial, and therefore doesn't always mean that it's not part of clinical effect. It could very well be, that is a result of clinical effect. But what we've got to do is first rule out a transcription error or a protocol deviation.
Okay.
Question that has come in. What have been the best strategies to advance this mindset shift for sites and CRAs? And then I'll let Kristin give her input on it. But I think the best strategies to advance this mindset shift is discussions like this, having the dialogue, providing examples, even internally within our organizations, providing examples of successes where we've used these technologies and tools and statistical analyses to identify something that previously would have gone unidentified because we weren't looking at it and we weren't using these tools to assist the CRAs in performing their jobs. Kristin, anything to add there?
No, I agree with you, Nicole. I think it is, discussions such as this, the rest of this four-part series that are going to help the industry as a whole continue to gain an understanding of what we're trying to accomplish through different approaches and methodologies around centralized monitoring, on-site monitoring. We're new, early on this journey, and so it's important to recognize that we're really just kind of starting, and so we need to give ourselves time to continue to have these discussions, and more of them are certainly needed.
Question here is centralized monitoring, or will it reduce site monitoring tasks? If yes, then what is the career opportunities for site monitors? I don't know if it will reduce the site monitoring tasks. As technology improves, you may be spending time investigating things that previously were unnoticed or unrecognized. So it's hard to tell exactly the impact at this point on site monitoring tasks. I think that right now we're seeing it as an addition to the site monitoring tasks. So the centralized monitoring activities or the investigations as part of that are an additional step that the CRAs are performing there on-site. So it's an additional task at the moment, and we're trying to offset that. We don't want to end up having to take more of time monitoring visits. But what we're trying to do, and Kristin alluded to this earlier, is reducing some of that 100% SDR and SDV activity, doing more of a sampling of SDR and SDV activity combined with targeted investigation into certain anomalies that we're finding in the centralized monitoring. So I think there's lots of career opportunities still out there for the site monitors, and I don't see their roles going away. We'll still need them certainly for those investigations and working with the sites on process improvement. What I do see is their roles changing to where instead of finding issues, they're helping to support you in fixing and preventing the issues from recurring.
Yeah, so to add, Nicole, there, we're seeing already in job descriptions and in all of the CRA, we're seeing the skill set requirement change a bit and shift to be more analytically focused. And so we'll continue to see that shift. And I apologize, my memory is fading a bit here, but I know that our group, ACRO, we were working with the Society of Clinical Research Associates to review the set list, correct, Nicole?
Correct.
And the changes in their responsibilities. So I agree with Nicole. It's the CRA will not go away. It will just be a different set of responsibilities, a different set of skills that need to be learned and developed.
I hear about how E6R2 is going to impact the medical device trials. I think that we'll see similar changes in some of the device trials as well. I just continue to see that these advances that we're making in how to harness and use technology more effectively and more efficiently, it's going to continue to advance all areas of the work that we're doing.
You have some experience working with medical device companies, and they are essentially looking at and absorbing these changes and in processes and procedures around them. So we think today.
The other question here that says, what percentage ratio of centralized monitoring compared to site monitoring? It's to say because I would say answer from a PPD perspective in that we're looking at deploying centralized monitoring on all studies that we're running. So it's used as a supplement to our on-site monitoring. So to say what percentage or ratio of the on-site versus remote, it's hard to say at the moment. We haven't really stopped doing a whole lot that the CRAs are doing now and replacing it completely with centralized monitoring. I think we continue to advance. That's what we're going to need to do. We need to evaluate the effectiveness of the analyses that we're conducting right now. So if we send findings to a CRA, they're identified as anomalies, the central monitor. What percentage of those findings actually result in something that really was a deviation or a transcription error? Versus the example just a few minutes ago that's just a clinical the process. We need to still continue to evaluate the preciseness and the accuracy of our centralized monitoring. And so as we continue to do that, I think you'll start to see more reliance on central monitoring. But right now, it really is a supplement, not a replacement complete at the moment. I think that's the goal long term, not to replace it completely, but to start shifting more to centralized monitoring. But right now, I think most companies in the industry are really looking at centralized monitoring and trying to see how effective, how efficient, how accurate, how precise and reliable it is. On that?
I'm going to comment from the regulatory perspective here. So myself and my team do a bit of consulting with organizations to help them look at E6R2 and come into compliance with it. And what we'll say is, and I totally agree with you, Nicole, that it's kind of supplementing and not replacing. What we advise sponsors to ensure is that they have if they're not using or performing any type of centralized monitoring, that they have a documented rationale for why they are not doing that. Because according to these new guidelines, we'll highly encourage that they're using it. So if they're not at the spot level, you need to have a reason why you're not doing that.
So other questions have popped up, and I realize we're running low on time. I will say that, there's certain questions on here about, what will we do about getting studies to better plan up front in the development of risk registers and like that, as well as questions around, the ratio of RBM and on-site monitoring, and then is the same monitor or different one performing central and on-site monitoring? These questions are hard to answer because every CRO and every client is working on slightly different variations and models in order to accomplish this. There's one size fit all in the strategy or the roles and responsibilities yet. I think that many different companies are exploring different ways, and just like the ratio between RBM and on-site monitoring, it really depends on the strategy of each individual organization and company. There are several sponsor companies whose goals for 2018 are to move to 100% of all trials, risk-based monitoring trials. Will we actually see that happen in 2018? I don't know. There's lots of other companies that are more cautious and want to kind of take a wait-and-see approach. Let's see what everyone else is doing first, and then we'll follow along. So I think that there's a lot of different variation that you'll see across both CRAs and sponsors at the moment. I will say that I really appreciate your engagement and all the questions today as we're looking at closing this out. We will have several other upcoming modules. We've got 3 more in this series. You can see the dates here and the titles. 2 will be on what could go wrong, and this is focused on the risk assessment process. So some of your questions there will be answered at that point. We'll have Module 3 discussed in a little bit more detail, centralized monitoring. And then finally, Module number 4 will be about operationalizing the change and the site management components of this guidance. And that will occur on April 22nd. So really appreciate all your time and your attention today. Thank you very much for all your questions. Mike, do you have any closing statements? Kristin?
Well, thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yeah, very much for your presentation today. As they said, we'll be on to the next one on, well, I just had it right up here a second ago, on Module 2, March 22nd, HE6R2, Investigative Sites and Risk Assessment, What Could Go Wrong. So we look forward to speaking to you all then. For the attendees on the call, please complete the post-webinar survey and evaluation immediately following this webinar as you close out of WebEx in order to receive your Contact Hour credit. For more on good technology practices, clinical and business practices for our other webinars, please visit our myscrs.org. In this mini-series, we run about 70 other webinars a year. For members, most of those, they're all free for members. So please go to the membership tab on our website and look at all the member benefits that we offer. See the SCRS Insight Journal, shown here on the last slide. We publish that quarterly for members. That's in the members section of our website, myscrs.org. And we look forward to seeing you all for the next presentation. And at Future Summits EU, we have that one at the end of March. Then we have our Asia Pacific and our Global Summit in October, of course. The only conference series entirely focused on the needs of clinical research sites. We appreciate everyone's participation in today's program. We look forward to having you join us for more webinars. Today's session has been recorded. We will forward the link out to you within the next 24 hours. We look forward to your feedback on the closing survey, and thanks again for joining us. Bye-bye, everyone.